Welcome to the Hymnology Archive podcast, where we specialize in the study of hymns, carols, spirituals, metrical psalms, and their intersections with other genres. That recording you just heard was the hymn, Now Thank We All Our God, text by Martin Rinkart, 1636, translated by Catherine Winkworth, 1858, with a tune by Johann Krüger, 1547, performed here by a group called the Contemporaries, a college group of Anderson University, Indiana, circa 1958 or 1959. The bass section of that group included a young Bill Gaither, who by that point was already an experienced singer, having sung in trios and quartets since he was about 14 years old. That recording comes courtesy of my guest today, Steve Krampitz, who has a pretty incredible collection of records, not just of Bill Gaither, but of Southern gospel music in general. Steve worked as a radio host for about 17 years before transitioning into the customer service industry. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Finally, good to meet you in person and be able to talk to you in person regarding all this stuff.
Yeah, thank you for being my guest. So is it fair to say your interest in discography and collecting comes from your time as a radio DJ?
Yeah, I would say that's totally true. I had spent some time with my college at Olivet Nazarene University on their radio station all 4 years. That was my major in school. And through that 4 years, we actually went from playing vinyl all the way into playing CDs. So I kind of went from one genre, one medium to the other medium during the course of that 4 years. And that's where I first got to have in my mind that there was so much of his music that was available on vinyl at the time.
So speaking of Bill Gaither specifically, when did you first become aware of his music?
His music I first became aware of when I had foster parents in middle school, and they happened to take me and my sister to a Bill Gaither trio concert at the Rosemont Horizon up by Chicago. Years later, I would talk to Gloria when I met her again when I was with Orpheus Choir at Olivet Nazarene University. We were one of the many choirs that helped make up the mass choir in the Bill Gaither Praise Gatherings for Believers that was held for quite a long time in Indianapolis, Indiana at the Hoosier Dome. And later on, I would ask her about those concerts that I saw him first at back in 1980. And she remembered it offhand just because her and I both have the same memory of them having to interrupt the concert from time to time because you could actually hear the airplanes from O'Hare International Airport going over the top of the auditorium.
Oh,
and her
wow.
and I both had that collective memory. That's how we knew that was the same concert.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you've mentioned meeting Gloria. Have you met Bill as well?
I had met him first on the campus of Olivet. I might have shared this with you, but I still have the audio from the interview that I did with him prior to their concert on the campus of Olivet. I guess that would have been, I think, in the fall of 1987. And that's when I first met him. I'd met him a little bit through this praise gathering stuff we had talked about since I was part of the mass choir that helped kind of support the on-stage worship services within praise gathering. But then I met him more personally with this interview thing because it was just him and I in this office with my small cassette tape player back at that point to actually record the 10-minute interview that I would eventually use for both the radio station at Olivet, and part of that would become in print to become part of the school newspaper as well.
Wow, that's quite an honor. Do you remember being nervous for that?
Oh, totally. I can't remember now if we had, if I actually plugged in the tape player at that point, if it was battery operated, but I know I probably tested it a few times to make sure that it would record and that it was going and that it was taking my voice. And I don't remember now if I may have had one of those smaller handheld microphones where the tape turns on and off with the off and on button on the condenser microphone. It was a small little thing plugged into the really small portable cassette player at that point. He was so honest and I never said no to any of my questions. It was just interesting to get his insight about things going on back then. It was kind of a point in his career where he was trying some new things and going a little more on the contemporary side. And then eventually, once the vocal band got started, he kind of reined that back just a little bit to go more towards Southern gospel instead. But at the time, he was kind of doing both, a little bit of both. And I think he was getting a little bit of backlash, unfortunately, from some people that kind of wanted him to stay Southern gospel all the time. And he tried to explain to me on the same thing that it's a decision to just go where the Lord leads and leave it up to him what style it is, and that there's always going to be discussions about who likes what other. But he always said, and I think he still believes it now, that the church is a big enough family that there's so many genres that can be enjoyed and not be strictly tied into just one. knowing that if it's bathed in prayer and that it's godly lyrics and those kind of things, and of course the godly lifestyle that's behind those, that the genre itself doesn't really matter.
Right. And I've listened to that interview, and he does speak about the way Christian music does not have a singular sound to it. There are always these influences, and he's very careful to say these aren't worldly, as in secular influences, but he does say Christian music does not happen in isolation or in a vacuum. So
Right.
we're always being influenced by the different sounds we hear out in the industry. But in that particular interview, I thought it was interesting because he talked about, for that particular concert, he was going for a more stripped down acoustic approach because he felt like that's what he wanted people to hear that night.
Well, you can't live in the world without being influenced by sounds that you hear. For the one who would argue that Christian music is using worldly sounds, Christian music has always used sounds that they hear. To us who've been in Christian music, the sound's never been that important. The most important thing is the lyric, what we are saying. So it's changed dramatically, and it'll keep changing, and it will not change without resistance of people saying that that's not godly or that's not spiritual. It used to be spiritual, now it's not spiritual anymore. I remember growing up in Nazarene church, one of the first evangelistic groups I heard was a Keller York party. It was two couples, and they had a bass, stand-up bass, and Jeanette York played it. And they were criticized at the time for being jazzy and all that stuff. But they were just communicating the gospel in terms that they understood.
Well, we met a few years ago because I was working on a detailed discography and biography of the Gaithers, and you stood out to me as someone who knew a lot about that material. How were you able to acquire so many rare recordings of the Gaithers from their earliest years?
That was just a lot of search and discovery, a lot through eBay. Some of it was just going through my local either Salvation Army or Goodwill and finding out about that. I was surprised when I first started looking into some of their older works that even their offices there in Alexandria at the time, I think their offices still are in Alexandria, that they did not have any written discography on him at all. So I kind of took it upon myself to try to get an outline. I can't remember even where I got that from at that point, since the internet wasn't really that big at that point. They may have maybe given me a short list of something, and then I just kind of expanded on that through different research things, eventually online and those kind of things. And then some of those, as you know, don't even say what year they came out. So I mean, I kind of had to guess and then probably ask people that had been around longer than I had been to try to get them in some kind of chronological order. I don't know for sure if I have them all in the right order now even, but I think I got them really close. And I still like to tell people, and I probably mentioned this to you as well, that as far as I am aware, the only discography that they have in their offices in Alexandria is the one I myself put together and gave to him and gave to their offices personally on a future trip to Gaither Studios, which at the time was called Pinebrook Studios.
Wow, that's incredible. I do know the effort that goes into creating something like that because you helped me with that as well for my website. And I did that because I couldn't find anything like that, at least not online.
Yep.
Yeah, so I definitely understand the work that goes into it. And you were an enormous help in helping me to create mine. So thank you for that.
Yes, I'm glad to help and get some information out there between all that. And that's something else that in doing all that research on my own, I had no idea that there was an incarnation of the Bill Gaither Trio before Bill and Gloria and Gary. I knew a little bit about maybe of course, Danny was in there at one point and Marianne, but I really didn't know that. If you probably have seen some of his biographies, he was singing with Marianne and Danny as early as probably high school, maybe even younger than that, as a trio in church before they kind of expanded that and eventually got their contract going with Benson, which was Heartwarming, a division of Benson at the time. And they signed their first commercial national contract with them in 1966.
Yeah, that's right. I don't have the date in front of me, but I do know Marianne was involved at a very young age. I think maybe age 11 or 12, singing with her brothers in that trio. Yeah, It's quite something.
And I also found out, you probably had read this somewhere at one time too, when Bill was attending Anderson University, his first foray, more or less, into more of a national scene he was the piano player for Doug Oldham. And that's how Doug became one of the first ones to sing some of his music in public, because Bill was his pianist. as he would travel, even as they were both college students at Anderson University, which was then known as Anderson College. So it kind of expanded into that. And then, of course, Gloria came along, and all those kind of things happened after that.
Yeah, and we'll talk some more about some of those connections, because one reason why he has been so successful is because of his ability to create so many connections. And we'll get into that. But first, as far as Bill Gaither's output goes, I think most of his material would be classified as Southern gospel, or his church songs are largely what we might call praise choruses. But the one song people universally recognize as a hymn is Because He Lives, written in 1970 and recorded in 1971 on the album Because He Lives with Bill Gaither, Gloria, and Bill's brother Danny.
How sweet to hold our newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives, but greater still the calm assurance our boy can face uncertain days because he lives.
The song has a little bit of a backstory to it. How would you put this song in the context of their lives and careers at that time?
That was something else, because I think you and I had talked about this a little bit. It was kind of a point in his career where there was a little bit of a downtime there, where he was having trouble coming up with new ideas and just kind of needed some kind of thing to refresh. And that's really what that came out of that, to be a kind of resurgence of his songwriting side between him and Gloria. And this came through, I think this is probably pretty well known too, that it came through the birth of their son, Benji.
Right. Yeah, that second verse, how sweet to hold a newborn baby, that is a direct reference to the birth of their son, Benji. And I also know, from what I understand of the story, Bill had been struggling with some form of depression. He had experienced some terrible writer's block, and some of that had to do with the general angst of what was happening in society at the time, the various kinds of protests happening across the country, the unrest and so forth. But yeah, the birth of their son, Benji, was something of a catalyst for him to be able to write that song and for him to keep going as a songwriter. By my count, they have recorded that song at least 20 times, including a 50th anniversary version in 2021 and a performance at the Getty Music Sing Conference that year.
I'm always amazed when I hear them talk about their upbringing and how they didn't really let fame, I guess if you want to call it that, really go to their heads or anything. As you might know, even now today in 2026, they still live in the same community back when they were first starting out in the business. The trio itself, as you have put on your website, and that I kind of helped with some cover art and things on there, that very first record of the trio came out around 1960. So he had just graduated from Anderson University around the time that had gotten done. He had sung with both Marianne and Danny in church and done some other things. He was on a quartet, I think, when we had talked about as early as maybe 14 years old. And then eventually the trio got started doing some recordings on their own in 1960. And they would eventually get their national commercial contract with Benson around, I think, 1966 or thereabouts. And Sincerely, I think, was the title of the album that was the very first one once they received that national contract. But they'd done maybe 5 or 6 records, I think, independently before that time. And it took me a while to collect those from first finding out what the titles were. Because even when I talked to the Gaither office at one point back in my college days about a discography, I was surprised to find out even Bill's own office did not have a written out discography of his trio works. So through the internet and through talking to his office, I was able to get this happening. So as far as I know, the only discography they have in their office, it's more or less a full, complete one, is the one I created for them shortly around the time that I graduated from Olivet. It was certainly a process of seeing how many titles there were that I had not even heard of before, and especially the stuff that was before the Benson contract in '66. That there were so many different ones with Bill Gaither Trio presenting, which was a Volume 1, Volume 2, and then a few other incarnations that even at one point, as you have put on the website, that there's clearly a point in there where the trio was Bill and 2 girls instead of Bill and his brother and of course Gloria. That Marianne, of course, and Danny were the original 3, but then it kind of went off a little bit to some other things before it settled down back to Danny again. And then when Danny went solo in around 70, you might know this, maybe around 75 or thereabouts, and that's when they recruited Gary McSpadden to take Danny's place. But it's just incredible to see how the Lord works to open doors and close different doors and make all this happen. It's just incredible to see kind of how far back that reaches to make it be what we got to know best as the Bill Gaither Trio, with either Danny or Gary being the ones that most people remember.
Yeah, a lot of variations of that group. Of course, it started out not with Gloria, but with Marianne, and then Gloria got involved. And then there were some recordings where Gloria stepped back and they recruited some other female singers. To me, it's part of why they ultimately have been successful, is because they've been continually able to reinvent themselves and bring in new singers, bring in new blood, and keep that going. Of course, one of those reinventions came in 1981 with the creation of the Gaither Vocal Band. Big defining moment for their careers. That vocal band has gone through several iterations of its own. Their album of hymns in 2014 was, I believe, their last album with Mark Lowry as a regular member. So my question for you is, how many careers do you think have been launched by people becoming a member of the Gaither Vocal Band?
Oh, boy. I would think there's quite a few. I remember, I didn't really know this at the time, but I found out later, Sandy Patty really got her start through being one of his backup singers. And of course, she became kind of like a breakout star, kind of, if you want to call it that, from helping with the praise gatherings and some other things that they had dates together for. And then eventually she would become a solo artist and go out on her own and become a big deal on her own. But I know she was certainly helped in her career with that. I remember hearing that Don Francisco, for instance, got his start through the Gaithers, and he may have been one of their special guests through a praise gathering. So he's got connections with them as well. Steve Green, of course, was one of the original members of the Gaither Vocal Band, and he was also a backup singer for the Gaithers before he went on his own. He was one of the original members of Whiteheart, so he had tried a little bit more CCM kind of style before he kind of backed it down to be more inspirational at one point too. But even Steve Green got a start through them. Lionel Harris was another one of those ones that had some other different things before getting with Gaither, but I think Gaither just got him to be more noticeable and more notoriety after he was with the vocal band as well.
Sure.
Mark Lowry certainly would be in that case too.
Guy
Mark
Penrod is legendary.
Guy Penrod, there's a few that are like that. So there's a good handful. I don't know if I've ever put a list together of all of them, but I'd say maybe a good 15 or thereabouts if you count everybody that was either background or became a solo artist or had some kind of position within their band and then went off to either be a solo artist or be part of somebody else's band. But I'm saying at least maybe 15, maybe more than that, I would think.
Yeah, very influential group. And of course, you mentioned the Homecoming series, which has also resuscitated some careers. The Homecoming series is ongoing, and there have been dozens and dozens of Homecoming recordings going as far back as 1991. What is your current understanding of Bill Gaither's musical activities, considering he recently turned 90 on March 28th and Gloria turned 86 on March 4th?
I just continue to be amazed at how active he is at his age, to be honest with you. I'm sure he has some good people working for him that help delegate certain things, I would imagine, but still, he keeps a pretty hefty schedule for as old as he is, with both being in the studio, being on tour, still writing with Gloria from time to time. He's written some books by now. And of course, he's still influential to recruit new people when he needs to, for either to infuse the vocal band or to help encourage some other younger people to be in the business, maybe on their own. But you look at him today, I mean, he's pretty much still involved with things like YouTube and all this technology. He's never really shied away from saying no. He had his own podcast for a while. So, I mean, he continues to learn, and I think that's something we can take notice of in our lives too, that you're never too old to learn. It's just amazing how far we've come, and that Bill Gaither has seen so much of that just in his own lifetime. Of course, he talks these stories a lot of times about when he was milking cows as a young kid in the barn and turning on the old barn radio and listening to his favorites like the Spear family were active even back then at that point. And he jokes how he listened to Gary McSpadden when he was a little boy, which isn't exactly true, but it was funny the way he said it in concert from time to time. But a lot of those same artists, he was able to help kind of revive their careers in their older age when the Homecoming series started around 1995. And a lot of those people hadn't been on the road for a long time and kind of been out of the public eye. And all of a sudden, as you have probably heard the story about the genesis of the Homecoming series, that he had just on a whim thought to bring a camera in to one of these times where him and some of these older people were getting together to, I'm trying to think if it was to celebrate maybe one of these older folks that had passed away, I think maybe. And he thought, well, we'll get him in a studio, just kind of relive some memories and just have a camera on the background, not even with a big camera crew or nothing, and see what happens to it. And he liked what he had and was able to edit some of that together, and that's what became the very first Homecoming video. And it kind of just went on from there, and still active today with either some of those same artists or kids of some of those artists by now.
Yeah, just in my own studies and in my own research, I can say Doris Akers, for example, the final 2 recordings she made were both Homecoming recordings. And so those probably would not have happened if Bill Gaither had not reached out to say, hey, come join us, come do this thing with us. We still value your career. Let us help you, give you that outlet. So yeah, what a rich legacy, what a rich career. There's so much we could cover, but let's save some of that for another time and another day. Thank you for being my guest today, Steve.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun to talk and reminisce about my experiences with the Gaithers, and I'm hoping they're not over. I'm going to still try to see them on concert when I get a chance, and say hi if I get to see him at the record table or things like that. But it's been quite fun to have this history with him, and kind of a unique history at times. I think we mentioned this before too, that I've even been able to visit Pine Brook Studios and was able to record some things in there with my college choir, and visit that kind of as a spectator later in the last, I'd say, about 20 years or so, just to see what it looks like. And now it's branded as Gaither Studios, and it used to be Pine Brook Studios. And it's just nice to be able to have those experiences, to meet him in person, be in his studio, and kind of know more about him, more or less on a more personal basis than maybe your normal person that just gets his records and that's all it is. So it's been really quite a blessing to be able to be that knowledgeable about him, even first person, because of getting autographs and talking to him on these interviews and things like that. But those are moments in my career and background that I will never forget and always cherish.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your memories with us. How can people find your YouTube channel for classic Gaither recordings? Because you do digitize a lot of those older recordings and make them available so people can hear them. How does that happen?
Yes, I have been able to do that. That's one of my little projects over the last, 10 years, I guess it would be, that I've gotten some real good software and a USB turntable and those kind of things to digitize those. Basically, it would be probably just easy to find me by my name, and you should be able to find my channel or find one of my videos, and then, of course, you find my full channel from one of those.
Well, of course, my listeners can find more material at gaither.com, and we have a detailed biography and discography at hymnologyarchive.com. There is a link to Steve Krampitz, YouTube, Gaither Archive. You can find that on my website, as well as the detailed history of the song Because He Lives. Stay tuned for more great interviews about hymns.
Keep